I never imagined that saving my son's life would be the very thing that would destroy mine. But when Jessica stood in my living room, the home I'd lived in for 40 years, with her lawyer and a stack of documents, telling me I had 72 hours to vacate the premises, I realized that kindness can sometimes be the most dangerous weapon you hand to someone. Welcome, this is Voice of Deborah and I tell true life stories. My name is Bella Brown and I'm 68 years old. For the past 4 decades, I've been a piano teacher in San Francisco, living in the modest Victorian home my late husband Jackson and I bought back in 1985. Jackson passed away from a heart attack 7 years ago, leaving me with our only son, Michael, and a mortgage that was finally paid off 3 years before his death. Life wasn't lavish, but it was mine. Secure. Comfortable. Or so I thought. Michael met Jessica at a tech conference in 2019. She was 32, beautiful in that effortless way that comes from good genes and expensive skincare, and working as a marketing consultant. I remember the first time he brought her to dinner. She smiled warmly, complimented my cooking, and asked thoughtful questions about my piano students. I wanted to like her. I tried to like her. But there was something in her eyes when she looked around my home, a calculating quality, like she was appraising furniture at an estate sale. "Mom's being paranoid," Michael would say whenever I gently voiced my concerns. "Jessica loves you. She's just reserved until she gets to know people." They married in a small ceremony in 2020, right before the world shut down. I gave them $20,000 from my savings as a wedding gift, money I'd been setting aside for emergencies. Jessica hugged me and cried, thanking me for being the mother she never had. Her own parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, she'd told us. She had no siblings, no close relatives. Just us now. That should have been my first red flag. But grief is a language I understood. I'd lost Jackson. I knew loneliness. So I opened my heart and my home to her. Trouble started small. Little things I brushed off. Jessica would make comments about my dated furniture or suggest I declutter my piano studio. "You could get so much more natural light if you removed some of these old instruments," she'd say, gesturing at the upright piano that had been my grandmother's. When I hosted family dinners, she'd arrive late and spend most of the evening on her phone, excusing herself from conversations with vague mentions of work emergencies. But Michael seemed happy, and that was what mattered to me. He'd struggled with anxiety and depression throughout his 20s, and Jessica's presence seemed to stabilize him. He smiled more. He was building a life. As a mother, you learn to swallow your doubts if it means your child's happiness. Everything changed in March of 2023. Michael collapsed at work. An emergency room, frantic phone calls, and then the diagnosis that made my blood run cold. Acute liver failure. A rare autoimmune condition that had been silently destroying his liver for months. Without a transplant, he had maybe 6 months to live. Maybe less. I didn't hesitate. I got tested immediately. By some miracle I was a perfect match. Jessica, however, had a different reaction. When the doctor explained that living donors could give a portion of their liver, which would regenerate in both donor and recipient, she went pale. "Margaret, you're 67, she said, her voice tight. "The risks." "I'm his mother," I interrupted. "There's no risk I wouldn't take." The surgery was scheduled for June 2023. In the weeks leading up to it, Jessica's behavior shifted. She became attentive, almost clingy. She'd come to my house with groceries, insisting I keep my strength up. She'd sit with me and talk about the future, about how grateful she and Michael were, about how I'd always have a place in their lives. "You're so brave, Margaret," she'd say, squeezing my hand. Not many mothers would do this. I remember thinking how wrong I'd been about her, how my instincts had failed me. She did love Michael. She was just showing it in her own way. The surgery went perfectly. I gave Michael 55% of my liver on June 14, 2023. The recovery was brutal, far more painful than the doctors had prepared me for, but every time I saw Michael's color returning, his strength rebuilding, it was worth it. Jessica visited us both in the hospital, bringing flowers and sitting beside Michael's bed, stroking his hair while he slept. "Thank you," she whispered to me one evening. Thank you for giving him back to me. I recovered slowly over the summer. Michael bounced back faster, the resilience of youth on his side. By September he was back at work part-time. I was still regaining my stamina, still attending follow-up appointments, still dealing with the occasional pain and fatigue that the doctors assured me would fade with time. Then, on October 3, 2023, Jessica's distant aunt died. I'd never heard of Aunt Marjorie before. According to Jessica, she was her father's sister, a wealthy, reclusive woman who'd made her fortune in pharmaceutical investments and had no children of her own. They'd barely spoken over the years, Jessica claimed. So when the lawyer called to inform her that Marjorie had left her entire estate to Jessica, her only surviving blood relative, we were all shocked. $33 million. Plus a portfolio of stocks and bonds and properties in 3 states. Michael was ecstatic. We'll never have to worry about money again, he said, his eyes bright. Mom, you can retire. Actually retire. No more teaching if you don't want to. Jessica smiled but said nothing. The change wasn't immediate. It was incremental, like water slowly eroding stone. First, Jessica and Michael moved out of their cramped apartment into a sprawling modern house in Pacific Heights. Jessica quit her job. She hired a personal trainer, a chef, and interior designer. Designer clothes appeared. Expensive jewelry. Michael started dressing differently too. Bespoke suits, luxury watches. When I visited their new home, Jessica gave me a tour with the enthusiasm of someone showing off a prize. Isn't it incredible? She gushed. We finally have the life we deserve. The word deserve stuck with me. What had they done to deserve it, beyond being related to a dead woman Jessica barely knew? But I kept my thoughts to myself. They'd invited me to Thanksgiving. Michael seemed genuinely happy. Who was I to rain on their parade? The distance between us widened through the fall. Michael's calls became less frequent. When we did talk, Jessica was always there in the background, and the conversations felt stilted, performative. When I suggested coming over for dinner, there were always excuses. They were traveling, renovating, too busy. By December, I'd seen my son exactly twice since the surgery that saved his life. Then, 2 days after Christmas, Jessica called me. Her voice was sugar-sweet. Bella, I've been thinking. You're living in that big old house all alone. The stairs must be getting difficult for you, especially after the surgery. What if we helped you find a nice senior living community? Somewhere you'd have people around, activities, meals prepared. You'd be so much more comfortable. My stomach dropped. Jessica, I'm 68, not 88. I teach 15 piano students a week from my home studio. I'm perfectly capable. Of course you are, she cooed. I'm just thinking about your future, your welfare. Michael and I were discussing it, and we think it might be time to consider your options before something happens. A fall, an emergency when no one's there to help. I told her I'd think about it and hung up, my hands shaking. The second red flag. Michael called the next day. Mom, Jessica told me about your conversation. She's really just worried about you. You know, after the surgery, we've both been thinking about how fragile life is. Michael, I said carefully, I'm fine. I'm happy in my home. I don't need. Just think about it, okay? His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. For us, we love you. We want you safe. I started to argue, but he'd already hung up. January brought colder weather and colder silences. Michael stopped returning my calls altogether. When I texted, his responses were brief, impersonal. Jessica never reached out again about the senior living suggestion, but the message had been sent loud and clear. I was becoming inconvenient. Then came February 7, 2024. The day my world imploded. The doorbell rang at 9 in the morning. I answered it to find Jessica standing on my porch, flanked by a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Behind them, a moving truck idled at the curb. Bella, Jessica said, her voice void of warmth. This is Howard Chen, my attorney. May we come in? Confused, I stepped aside. They entered my living room, the room where Michael had taken his first steps, where Jackson and I had danced on our 20th anniversary, where I taught hundreds of children to play piano, and Jessica nodded to the lawyer. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Mrs. Brown, I'm here to inform you that as of last week, your son Michael Brown has signed over the deed to this property to his wife, Jessica Brown, as a gift. The transfer is legal and binding. Mrs. Jessica Brown is now the sole owner of this residence. The room tilted. What? That's not possible. Michael doesn't own this house. I do. The lawyer's expression didn't change. According to county records, the deed was transferred to Michael Brown in September of 2023, with you retaining lifetime residence rights. Last week, Michael signed over full ownership to his wife. Those residence rights have been revoked. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. My mouth went dry. I never transferred anything to Michael. This is my house. My husband and I bought it 40 years ago. Jessica stepped forward, her face a mask of false sympathy. Bella, you don't remember, do you? You signed the papers in August, right after your surgery. You were on so many pain medications. We were helping you organize your affairs, remember? In case something went wrong with your recovery. You wanted Michael to have security. I never signed anything. My voice was rising, panic flooding my chest. You're lying. There's your signature right there. The lawyer pointed to a document in the folder. And there it was. My signature, shaky but unmistakable, dated August 30th, 2023. I had no memory of signing any such thing. But I'd been on heavy painkillers that entire month, foggy and exhausted, barely able to stay awake for more than a few hours at a time. They'd taken advantage of me when I was at my most vulnerable. When I'd just given part of my body to save my son's life. Where is Michael? I demanded. I want to talk to my son. Jessica's expression hardened, the mask slipping. Michael is done being manipulated by your guilt trips. You've controlled him his whole life, and he's finally free. You got what you wanted, you played the martyr with the surgery, made yourself the hero. Now it's time to step back and let him live his life. I stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. This woman who I'd welcomed into my family, who'd watched me give my own liver to save her husband, who'd held my hand and called me brave. Why? The word came out as a whisper. She smiled and it was chilling. Because I can. Because people like you are always so easy, always so desperate to be loved that you give everything away without thinking. You gave us the down payment for our first apartment with that wedding gift. You gave us Michael's life with your surgery. And you signed over your house because you were too drugged up to read what you were signing. That's not my fault. That's you being stupid. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Brown, you have until Saturday at 5 p.m. to remove your belongings. After that, anything left will be disposed of, and you'll be charged for storage and removal costs. They left me standing in my living room, my home for 4 decades, suddenly rendered homeless by the son I'd nearly died for and the daughter-in-law I'd tried to love. I spent that day in shock, barely able to process what had happened. I called Michael's cell phone 17 times. Every call went to voicemail. I texted him, pleading, demanding, begging for an explanation. No response. I drove to their Pacific Heights mansion and rang the doorbell for 20 minutes. No one answered, though I could see lights on inside. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my grandmother's piano, my fingers resting on keys I'd played since childhood, and tried to understand how my life had come to this. I'd been careful. I'd worked hard, saved money, paid off my mortgage. I'd raised a good son. I'd given him my liver for God's sake. And now I had 3 days to find somewhere to live with only my Social Security income and the few $1,000s left in my savings account. But as I sat there in the darkness, something shifted inside me. The shock began to crystallize into something harder, clearer. I thought about Jessica's face when she'd called me stupid. The cold calculation in her eyes. The casual cruelty of someone who'd never paid a price for their actions. And I remembered something. Something I'd pushed to the back of my mind because it had seemed unimportant at the time. In September, when Jessica inherited the money, She'd mentioned her aunt's lawyer handling the estate. I'd been polite and asked a few questions the way you do. And Jessica had let slip that the inheritance came with conditions. Aunt Marjorie had apparently been paranoid about fortune hunters and had stipulated that Jessica could only access the full inheritance if she remained married and, in good moral standing, for a period of 5 years following Marjorie's death. If she divorced or was found to have committed fraud or criminal acts during that period, everything would go to charity. At the time, it had seemed like an odd but harmless eccentricity. Now it was a loaded gun. I spent all of Thursday making phone calls. First, to a real estate attorney who reviewed the deed transfer documents and confirmed that, yes, if I'd signed while under the influence of medication without independent legal counsel present, there might be grounds to challenge it, but it would require a lengthy, expensive court battle I couldn't afford. Then I called the hospital and requested my complete medical records from my surgery and recovery. I documented every medication I'd been prescribed, every dosage, every warning label about impaired judgment and decision-making. I photographed the bottles, still in my medicine cabinet. I pulled out my journal from that summer, where I'd written rambling, nearly incoherent entries about the pain and confusion. On Friday morning, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I hired a private investigator. His name was Ray Martinez, a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. I told him everything: the inheritance, the timing of the deed transfer, Jessica's sudden coldness, the eviction. I showed him the documents, and I asked him to dig into Jessica's background. All of it. Mrs. Chen, Ray said, I'll be straight with you. This sounds like elder abuse, but proving it is tough. However, if this woman has done this before, if there's a pattern that changes things, give me 48 hours. I only have until tomorrow at 5 p.m., I said. He smiled grimly. Then I'd better work fast. Don't pack anything yet. Just wait. That Friday night I barely slept again. I kept checking my phone, hoping Michael would call, would explain, would come to his senses. But there was only silence. Saturday morning arrived cold and gray. The moving truck pulled up at noon, 4 hours before my deadline. I watched from the window as 2 men climbed out and stood on my porch, waiting. Jessica's lawyer pulled up behind them in his Mercedes. My phone rang. Ray Martinez. Mrs. Brown, do not leave that house. I'm sending you something right now. Print it out. And call your son. Tell him if he doesn't come to the house in the next hour, these documents are going to the police and the estate's trustee. The email arrived 30 seconds later. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 7 police reports from 3 different states spanning 8 years. Jessica's real name was Jennifer Harlow. She'd been married twice before Michael, both times to men who'd recently come into money or valuable assets. The first husband, in Denver, had died in a suspicious car accident 6 months after their marriage. The second, in Seattle, had survived but lost his business and his savings after Jessica cleaned out their joint accounts and disappeared. There were restraining orders, fraud investigations that had never quite stuck, allegations of forgery, of drugging, of systematic financial abuse. And most damning of all, there were court records showing that Jennifer, had no dead aunt named Marjorie. The inheritance had come from a woman named Marjorie Hightower, who was very much alive and had never given Jessica a dime. She'd forged the entire inheritance. All $33 million had been embezzled from her former employer's client trust accounts over a period of 3 years. The FBI had been investigating for 6 months, slowly building their case. Ray had one more thing to tell me. The feds were about to move in on her, but they've been waiting to catch her in the act of laundering the money. Your eviction, your house. It's part of her escape plan. She's trying to liquidate assets, probably planning to run. If you confront her now, with your son present, you might be able to get him out before the arrests happen. He's probably not criminally liable if he didn't know about the fraud, but he needs to cooperate immediately. I printed everything. My hands were steady now. The grief had been burned away, replaced by a cold, clear determination. Called Michael. This time I left a voicemail. Michael, I know what Jessica is. I know everything. If you don't come to the house in the next hour, the house she stole from me while I was recovering from giving you my liver, I'm taking what I know to the police. Your wife is a con artist and a thief, and you have one chance to separate yourself from her before this destroys your life. 1 hour. I hung up and waited. 40 minutes later, Michael's car pulled up. He got out alone, his face pale and drawn. When I opened the door, he looked 10 years older than he had at Christmas. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know about any of it. I swear to God I didn't know." I handed him the documents. He sank onto my couch, the same couch where he'd watched cartoons as a child, and read through everything. I watched his face as the truth settled over him like a shroud. The color drained from his cheeks. His hands began to shake. "She told me you'd signed over the house because you wanted me to have security," he whispered. "She said you were getting forgetful, that it was for the best. And the inheritance." Mom, I never questioned it. I saw the lawyer, the documents, the bank statements. I thought it was real. "How much is left?" I asked quietly. "She spent almost $8 million. New house, cars, jewelry, investments, that I realize now were probably just her moving money around. Mom, I'm so sorry. I let her poison me against you. Every time you called, she'd say you were trying to guilt-trip me, that you were manipulating me, that I needed to set boundaries. And I believed her because I was so grateful to be alive, and she was there and she seemed to love me, and I thought." He broke down then, sobbing into his hands. "I let her steal your home. After you saved my life. What kind of son does that make me?" I sat beside him and took his hand. The kind who was manipulated by a professional. "But Michael, listen to me. The FBI is about to arrest her. If you want any chance of protecting yourself, you need to call them right now. You need to cooperate fully. You need to tell them everything you know and everything you don't know. Do you understand?" He nodded, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. The FBI arrived at my house 2 hours later. Michael gave them everything. Bank records, documents, passwords, every detail of Jessica's movements over the past months. They recorded his statement for 3 hours. And then they left to execute arrest warrants. They found Jessica at the airport, boarding a private jet to the Cayman Islands with 4 suitcases full of cash and jewelry. She was arrested on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and elder abuse. Her lawyer, Howard Chen, who turned out to be her boyfriend and accomplice, was arrested at his office. The house deed transfer was invalidated within a week. A judge reviewed my medical records and testimony and ruled that I'd been unable to give informed consent while under heavy medication. My home was returned to me. Michael filed for divorce immediately. He cooperated fully with federal prosecutors. Because he'd been kept in the dark about the fraud and had no access to the accounts Jessica controlled, and because he volunteered everything he knew, he avoided criminal charges. But the process destroyed him emotionally. The man who came out the other side was humbled, broken, and slowly rebuilding himself. Jessica, Jennifer Harlow, was convicted on 17 federal counts. She's currently serving 22 years in federal prison. Howard Chen got 15. The embezzled money, what was left of it, was seized and returned to the victims of her fraud. Michael moved back in with me for 6 months while he put his life back together. We spent that time talking, really talking about everything, about his father's death, about his struggles with anxiety, about how people like Jessica target the vulnerable and isolated, about how I'd almost lost everything because I'd been too trusting, and how he'd almost lost his soul because he'd stopped listening to his instincts. He's living on his own now, working as an accountant and seeing a therapist twice a week. He comes to dinner every Sunday. We're rebuilding what was broken, slowly, like my liver regenerated after the surgery. Cells dividing, tissue healing, stronger in the broken places. I still teach piano from my home studio. I still live in the house Jackson and I built our life in. But I'm different now. More cautious. More aware that kindness can make you vulnerable. And that vulnerability can be weaponized by those who see love as weakness. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. I'm sharing this not for pity, but because I know I'm not alone. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, family manipulation. These things happen more often than we like to admit. We want to trust the people we love. We want to believe that family means something. But sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us most. The lessons I learned are these. First, never sign anything when you're on medication or in pain. Never. Get independent legal advice. Take your time. It doesn't matter who's pressuring you or why. Second, trust your instincts. I knew something was wrong with Jessica from the beginning, but I talked myself out of it because I wanted Michael to be happy. Don't ignore those warning bells. They're ringing for a reason. Third, document everything. Keep records, save emails, take notes. If something feels off, create a paper trail. Might save your life. And finally, don't be ashamed to ask for help. I almost gave up. I almost accepted that I'd been beaten. But reaching out to that investigator, fighting back even when it seemed hopeless, that made all the difference. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Drop a comment below telling me your thoughts, or if you've experienced something similar. We heal by sharing our stories and standing together. And remember, you are never too old to fight for what's yours. You are never too broken to start over. And you are never, ever alone. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.